Going back to the beginning of the script after I've written the whole thing, I see that I go through some ideas very quickly, and some quotes are honestly pretty lengthy. Because of this, if you want to follow along closely, I recommend pausing at different points so you can have more time to read the quotes. Lately, I've taken a greater interest in the relationship between my ethical beliefs and different kinds of political views that might emerge from them. I want to better understand the political situation, commonly referred to as liberalism, that I find myself in. Not necessarily to reject it, it's worth noting. While there are numerous approaches to doing something like this, such as a study of history, law, or sociology, I've been focusing on ethics and political philosophy. A particular philosophical debate that piques my interest is the liberal-communitarian debate that occurred in the English-speaking philosophy world, starting in the 70s with the release of American philosopher John Rawls' A Theory of Justice, and continuing through the 80s. John Rawls is one of the most famous political philosophers of the 20th century, who is largely characterized as a champion of the liberal position in his translation of Kantian philosophy into what is commonly considered a Rawlsian liberal political framework. The debate really begins with the communitarian responses to Rawls' A Theory of Justice. The communitarian critique of liberalism is one among a number of criticisms, the main other ones being conservatism, Marxism, and feminism. What I like about this debate is that the thinkers involved are always discussing the relationship between our personal conceptions of the good and the best political structure to realize these beliefs. The ideas they discuss have implications for questions like, should something immoral be illegal, or are there certain goods or services that should not be bought and sold on the market? In this video, I will not be giving a full account of the debate, but will be focusing more closely on the communitarian critiques of Rawlsian liberalism. My goal is not argumentative, it is just to explain some of these critiques. The first thing that I want to emphasize is that just because I am focusing on the communitarian side does not mean that they have the last word in the debate. It is not the case that the liberals cannot and have not responded to the critiques made by communitarians. Any responses are just outside the scope of this video, and I will consider them for a future video topic. Before I begin, it is also important to get a specific confusion out of the way. In contemporary politics in America, we commonly use the word liberal, from what I understand, to describe either a Democrat or someone who supports the Democratic Party. When I use the term liberal or liberalism, I will be referring to the underpinnings of a particular position in political philosophy, and I will explain exactly what I mean by this in just a moment. One final note, since I am moving into the realm of the political, I want to make it extra clear that, although I have talked about my interests a little bit in the intro, no view that I am explaining in this video or any other video necessarily receives my endorsement merely on the fact that I am explaining it. I'll reiterate that this video is not making an argument and is intended just to be expository. It's important that we first begin with an understanding of both liberalism and communitarianism. Being general terms, they are somewhat difficult to define. Many thinkers in the modern era have been called liberal, whether classical or neo, and the term communitarian, while much newer, has not been readily accepted by those who many consider to be communitarian. Despite these facts, it is essential to at least begin to define them. Liberalism, or the corresponding term liberal, for the purposes of this video, refers to a set of arguments about the justification of political action and political institutions. While varying from thinker to thinker, the liberal set of arguments more or less carries an emphasis on the values of equality, freedom, and toleration, and a genuine openness to different models of human fulfillment. The term will basically be signaling an interpretation of John Rawls' position in A Theory of Justice, although evidently there are many thinkers categorized under the term liberal that are not Rawls himself, some before and some after. This position holds that the government should be primarily concerned with upholding rights and individual freedom and autonomy, rather than some conception of the good. For example, a liberal government might uphold freedom of speech, focused on the right of the individual to speak, rather than be concerned with the content of the speech, whether true or false, moral or immoral. The communitarian position, on the other hand, questions the liberal understanding of the relation between the individual and her society or community, and argues that the emphasis on individual freedom and rights that follows from that understanding is misplaced. Generally, communitarianism sees the individual's relationship to different communities as essential to political life, with implications for understanding the self and morality. Since this video aims to unpack the communitarian critique, much more will be said on what this means later. First, however, it is essential to gain a firm understanding of the ideas foundational to this debate found in Rawls' A Theory of Justice. The work is essential because communitarian critics and defenders of liberalism other than Rawls have formulated their positions in terms that make explicit reference to his theory. This makes it a good option as the fundamental starting point for the debate, although it is worth noting that Rawls does amend his positions a little bit later in his career in response to different criticisms he received. The central concern of the work, as you can probably tell by the title, is furthering a theory of justice, and for Rawls, his thought is that justice should be understood as fairness. Rawls believes that an analysis of justice will lead us to our political theory, which in turn will lead us to the actual construction of the best possible society. Justice as fairness conveys the idea that the principles of justice are agreed to in an initial situation that's fair. The twin ideas at the heart of justice as fairness are that of the original position and the veil of ignorance. For Rawls, the way to imagine a just or fair organization of society is to imagine what principles would be agreed to if people knew nothing about their own circumstances. The best way to imagine this is his famous original position thought experiment. Rawls believes that the principles decided on in this experiment are those that free and rational persons concerned to further their own interests would accept. In this original position, members of society hypothetically congregate to decide on the best principles to adhere to in order to construct the greatest society. In order to ensure fairness, the members are behind a veil of ignorance, in which they have no knowledge about themselves. This means that they do not know things like class or social status, intelligence, or strength. Notably, Rawls also assumes that the people in the original position do not know their own conception of the good. The original position intends to capture the belief that we should be regarded as equal, regardless of talent or social circumstance, in our proper conception of justice, and the belief that we should be regarded as free, meaning that one has freedom from any conception of how their own life should be conducted. It reflects two common political values that people tend to favor. While many people have little problem with the first notion of equality in the original position, the second consideration of freedom might be more difficult to assent to, especially for the communitarians. They ask why the way we seek to order our lives personally is irrelevant to justice in the political sphere. Here, the driving force behind the freedom of Rawlsian liberalism appears. Each person's conception of the good should not be relevant to political justice. For the liberal, not positing a central good for society to pursue allows a type of freedom for individuals to pursue their own chosen paths of the good, and also to change their mind. Thus, based on what I have said so far, it is tenable for the Rawlsian liberal to have their own conception of the good, but not see it as a relevant affair for justice in the political sphere. For example, I could think the purpose of human life is to cultivate relationships with other people, and through these relationships foster a deeply intertwined community, but not see it as proper for the government to enforce or even promote the formation of these kinds of relationships. Going back to the original position, Rawls thinks that there would be two principles that members of society would rationally agree upon. Mulhall and Swift have connected these two principles with the two political goals mentioned earlier, freedom and equality. I will only be mentioning the principle concerned with freedom because it is most relevant to our discussion. This principle is that each person is to have an equal right to the most extensive total system of equal basic liberties compatible with the similar scheme of liberties for others. This is definitely abstract, so it's easier to see how a framework like this operates with a more concrete example. A liberal society such as our own, guided by the principle, might be likely to adopt freedom of religion. But let's say person A wants to express his religious faith by murdering person B. In this framework, a person may have a right to practice their religion, but they cannot defend an act that violates another person's, say, autonomy by appealing to their religious freedom, since this right would be incompatible with the scheme of liberties from autonomy interference afforded to others. This is logic that motivates a lot of our political thinking in America already, so one can probably imagine a lot more examples. With this understanding, we can move on to the specific communitarian critiques. In 1982, Michael Sandel published Liberalism and the Limits of Justice, that essentially sparked what would become known as the liberal-communitarian debate. Mulhall and Swift identify criticisms that Sandel makes of Rawls' theory of justice. He takes issue with what he sees as the liberal conception of the person, moral subjectivism, and contradictory notions of the self present in Rawls' writing. Sandel broadly characterizes Rawls' political theory as one that is upheld by a deontological liberalism. Deontological liberalism holds that society, being composed of a plurality of persons, each with their own aims, interests, and conceptions of the good, is best arranged when it is governed by principles that do not themselves presuppose any particular conception of the good. This means that it is based on the primacy of justice, or right, over the good. He argues this by pointing out two ways justice is given primacy: moral and rational or foundational. The moral primacy of justice in Rawls is exhibited when the demands of other political and social values can never be allowed to trump those of justice. For example, we can imagine a society where a majority believe that it is immoral to kill an animal. However, say there is a minority religion in the society that practices animal sacrifice. If this society was politically organized with this type of liberalism, it is conceivable that this minority religion would be protected, since the popular moral value would not override the rights of the religious adherents. Here it's probably beneficial to get more clear about what we mean by the right and the good, since they both sound like they could mean the same thing in ethics, as in it is right to do something or it is good to do something. In the political sphere, the right corresponds to the ability to undertake a certain action with a certain goal in mind. However, the mere ability to undertake a certain action does not tell you what kind of action you should take or whether or not you should even undertake that action. For example, broadly in America there's freedom of religion, meaning that one can practice whichever religion they choose. However, the choice of which religion to follow or not follow is up to the individual. One may possibly make a choice by evaluating argumentation about things like God, the natural world, or their own spiritual experience, but the point is that the individual selects which path it is good for them to follow. This is the individual's conception of the good, and the choice they make will determine what goals they set for themselves and how they believe a good, valuable life will be lived. This is the difference between the right and the good. The second type of primacy, rational or foundational, is what makes this type of liberalism deontological, holding that justice has a privileged justification in that its principles are independently derived. In comparison to other moral views, it is opposed to utilitarian liberalism in that it gives a categorical priority to right, not for the purpose of utility or consequence. A utilitarian liberal, for example, might be forced to admit that we may violate justice for a reason that produces more utility. An example of this would be choosing to convict a criminal of a serious crime, despite the fact that all the evidence for this criminal's involvement was obtained unlawfully. Additionally, this primacy is also opposed to teleology, in that it does not presuppose any final human purposes or ends, or any determinate conception of the good life. This will come up later in our discussion of MacIntyre. If you have learned about philosophy before, you might recognize the term deontological from a study of the ethics of Immanuel Kant. There actually is a connection here between Kant's ethics and Rawls' political philosophy. Kant is the greatest of classical deontological liberals in that he provides his theory of the person, or self, that explains the categorical priority of the right over the good. The fact that humans have a will that they can exercise freely precludes the different ways that they will exercise it, as this capacity is what distinguishes humans and grants them dignity. Thus, what really matters is not the personal end that one selects, but the capacity for choice. Just as right is prior to the good, so the subject is prior to its ends. Rawls gives absolute priority to justice. Justice is the first virtue of social institutions, as truth is of certain systems of thought. A theory, however elegant and economical, must be rejected and revised if it is untrue. Likewise, laws and institutions, no matter how efficient and well arranged, must be reformed or abolished if they are unjust. Additionally, later in his book, he claims that we should reverse the relation between the right and the good proposed by teleological doctrines and view the right as prior. Thus, it is clear that Rawls chooses the right over the good, and this is what demarcates his position as a liberal, in contrast to the communitarians who will begin to favor the good. In addition to right, Sandel asserts that, in order to ground his central views in a theory of justice, Rawls is committed to a certain view of the self. Since his view is that what most deserves respect in humans is the ability to choose their aims and conceptions of the good, then, analogously, the identity of the self comes before the specific ends that the self chooses. According to Rawls, the self is prior to the ends which are affirmed by it, and what we cannot do is express our nature by following a plan that views the sense of justice as but one desire to be weighed against the others. To compromise it is not to achieve for the self free reign, but to give way to the contingencies and accidents of the world. Further, the account of the self as set before the good can be seen in Rawls' original position. Sandel sees Rawls as making significant assumptions about how the parties in the original position view themselves in society, those of which are actually necessary to construct a thought experiment like this. For Rawls, the circumstances of justice obtain whenever mutually disinterested persons put forward conflicting claims to the division of social advantages under conditions of moderate scarcity, in which parties try to advance their conception of the good as best they can, and that in attempting to do this they are not bound by prior moral ties to each other. Sandel's reading is as follows. The conception of society set forth is of a mutually beneficial venture undertaken by a group of disinterested individuals, each advancing their own conceptions of the good, making an empirical claim about human societies which may be controversial. An alternative would be, for example, that humans have a deep necessity to live in community with one another and enter into society in order to recognize both themselves and others in this community. Sandel believes that all interest in the Rawlsian picture would be self-interest instead of community-oriented. One might respond, assuming Sandel is right, where is the flaw? Just because all interests in this conception of society are self-interest does not mean that people cannot be benevolent. The fact that individuals have a number of plans open to them allows for the individual to choose to orient themselves toward a community. While Sandel has multiple criticisms of this view, The most important is that he believes that a result of this view is the belief that the ends people choose are never integral to their identity. This entails that no commitment could grip one so deeply that one could not understand themselves without it. No transformation of life purposes and plans could be so unsettling as to disrupt the contours of one's identity. For Sandel, Rawls' conception of the self carries a lack of understanding of the relation between a self and any community-directed end to which that self is committed. This would include a failure to account for obligations to tribe, nation, or even family. Following from this, Sandel draws a belief that Rawls' conception of the self commits him to an impoverished understanding of political community. The key here is that the stance of neutrality and competing conceptions of the good that will arise in liberal society stems from a non-neutral position on the conception of a person and their relationship to their conception of the good. Thus, liberal political theory itself would not rule on the goodness or badness of community-oriented conceptions of the good, the most forceful of these again being the family, say a parent's commitment to their child, which may make the view undesirable as some view the family as an essential component of society and broader political life. This can be seen in the way that Rawls suggests that one might choose a conception of the good. We can say that the rational plan for a person is a plan that would be decided upon as the outcome of careful reflection in which the agent reviewed in light of all the relevant facts and thereby ascertained the course of action that would best realize his more fundamental desires. Sandel criticizes here the fact that self-reflection does not seem to extend to asking who we really are, rather than just what desires we have. The way that Rawls frames this rational plan is not a mistake, but actually follows from the picture of the self that he has drawn, in which desires will be contingent and not essential parts of the self. By contingent, I mean here that desires will be seen as a matter of preference, rather than ones that stem from intrinsic human characteristics in correspondence with an intrinsic good, for instance, a robust social life corresponding with an essential need for community. And we can see this in Rawls. But how in general is it possible to choose among plans rationally? We eventually reach a point, though, where we just have to decide which plan we most prefer without further guidance from principle. Using the principles of rational choice as guidelines, and formulating our desires in the most lucid form we can, we may narrow the scope of purely preferential choice, but we cannot eliminate it altogether. The main point of what Sandel is saying here is that if choosing a good is ultimately based on arbitrary preference, then we are in danger of assenting to the idea that the good itself is ultimately arbitrary, thus committing the liberal to some form of moral subjectivism. Here I am reminded of a moment in the history of ethics. German philosopher
Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel
made his famous empty formalism critique of the ethical thought of Immanuel Kant, first appearing in his essay
über die wissenschaftliche Behandlungsarten des Naturrechts,
and continued later in his philosophy of right. The critique says that morality is doomed to be an empty formalism that from the moral standpoint Kant espouses, there is no criterion at all of moral right and wrong, or possibly a weaker objection. It cannot give us a completely satisfactory account of our duties. Already we can see connections to Sandel's appraisal of Rawls' view on the good, but a closer look reveals even more connections. Essentially, on Kant's conception, Hegel tells us practical reason renounces the content of law. This is in reference to Kant's ethical formula of universal law, one formulation of Kant's categorical imperative. So act that you can will the maxim of your action to be a universal law. According to this rule, I can find out if an action I am considering doing is ethically permissible in a number of ways. One of them being imagining my action as a universal law that governs what all rational beings must do in similar circumstances. For example, if I want to know if I should love my spouse, I can see that it seems reasonable that it be held as a universal law that people should love their spouses, and thus find that this is ethically permissible. If I want to kill someone because I have a strong desire to, and I universalize this prospect, I find that it is unreasonable that everyone would kill someone if they have a desire, and thus murder is morally impermissible. But, Hegel argues, because the categorical imperative itself has no content and tests merely the formal fitness or universalizability of maxims, its legislation can be no better than arbitrary. In the examples I gave about marriage and murder, Hegel would push back on the notion that there actually is any sort of violation of universality in the hypothetical worlds where I have made my maxim a universal law. If the moral permissibility of a maxim is a function of no more than its universalizability, then any maxim on Hegel's view can pass the test. The idea is that other ends and material grounds must be presupposed in order to shed light on the moral value of an action. Notice that the conclusions I arrived at about marriage and murder were informed by personal values about those things. Evidently, if I think marriage is bad for society, then I might conclude that it is impermissible for someone to love their spouse, and if I don't see a problem with the complete annihilation of society, then there should be no reason I condemn murder as a result of Kant's test. While the conclusions I arrived at are relatively uncontroversial, the point Hegel makes is that the actual moral worth of the maxims being assessed in the categorical imperative depends on external content that the test does not itself provide. Thus, the formula of universal law risks arbitrary assignment of moral worth to different actions. Now, whether or not Hegel's criticism is warranted is outside the scope of this video, but the similarity of Hegel and Sandel here is interesting. While Rawls provides a framework of political justice, conceptions of the good cannot be weighed against each other in a fruitful way solely within this framework, without external content being provided to assist with judgment. Sandel worries that Rawls' demarcation of political justice, in which conceptions of the good are a result of arbitrary preference, will leave adherents open to moral arbitrariness, much like how Hegel sees Kant's formula of universal law. Getting back to the main topic, we can summarize Sandel's critiques as follows: a pushback on the prioritization of the right over the good, Rawls' view of the liberal self in which conceptions of the good are not essential to identity, and the possible moral subjectivist consequences of this view. The second thinker I want to focus on is Scottish philosopher Alasdair MacIntyre. In the preface to the third edition of his most famous work, After Virtue, he mentions the Liberal-Communitarian Debate by name. Interestingly, he says that he has never been a communitarian, and goes as far as saying that communitarians hold views that are compatible with the values of liberalism that he rejects. He claims to support the best type of human life, that in which the tradition of the virtues is most adequately embodied, is lived by those engaging in constructing and sustaining forms of community directed towards the shared achievement of those common goods without which the ultimate human good cannot be achieved. Mulhall and Swift point out that Alasdair MacIntyre's work operates at a much higher level of generality and involves a much broader sweep of moral and cultural history than does Sandel's work. Because of this, it will take a much more thorough analysis to view his writing as a critique of Rawlsian liberalism. Still, he does explicitly reference Rawls in his political theory and makes criticisms of liberal conception of the person, the commitment to a form of skepticism about the possibility of rationality or objectivity in moral matters, the misrepresentation of the role of communal life to the identity and integrity of the individual, and liberalism's illusion of neutrality for conceptions of the good life. You might notice a similarity to Sandel here. There definitely is one, but as we'll see, MacIntyre differs from Sandel because MacIntyre dives further into the interaction between modern liberal society and the moral life of the individual. MacIntyre's After Virtue is the most important text for our purposes. Similar to Rawls, MacIntyre is a thinker who changes over time, and he has written more works since the publishing of After Virtue, one of which I will touch on briefly, so this exposition is not meant to capture his current or final thoughts in any respect. In the book, he proposes a certain understanding of moral discourse in modern liberal democracies, in which societies like these are beset with arguments for which their frameworks of debate are not equipped to handle. Take, for example, the debate about the morality and legality of abortion in the US. The pro-life camp argues against the morality and/or legality of abortion, usually by appealing to the fetus's right to life, while the pro-choice camp argues for the moral permissibility and/or legality of abortion by appealing to the woman's right to bodily autonomy. Notice the incommensurable fundamental assertions in the arguments of the two camps, while they simultaneously appeal to the same thing, a right. MacIntyre identifies this as emotivism, in that the contemporary discussion in liberal society is emotivist. Emotivism holds that the essence of moral judgments is and has always been one's personal feelings or attitudes. As seen in the account of the abortion debate that I have just laid out, contemporary discussion uses fundamentally irresolvable moral beliefs to approach the same moral issue. And if you press the average person on this issue with a question line of why questions, they will identify a subjective fundamental view of the situation that, nevertheless, they insist is the moral option in the debate. This is because the emotivist self lacks proper rational criteria to determine which viewpoint it should hold, so it simply works forward from its current desires or subjective reflections, in this case where it assigns a right, similar to the Rawlsian self that works forward from its reflection to determine its conception of the good. For MacIntyre, what is crucial is that on which the contending parties agree, namely that there are only two alternative modes of social life open to us. In the abortion debate, one either finds the right of the fetus compelling or the right of the woman compelling, and the debate continues unresolved. MacIntyre believes that this type of discussion is no historical accident and actually stems from the project of the Enlightenment. The 18th century moral philosophers engaged in what was an inevitably unsuccessful project, but they did indeed attempt to find a rational basis for their moral beliefs in a particular understanding of human nature, while inheriting a set of moral injunctions on the one hand, and a conception of human nature on the other, which had been expressly designed to be discrepant with each other. This discrepancy was not removed by their revised beliefs about human nature. They inherited incoherent fragments of a once coherent scheme of thought and action, and since they did not recognize their own peculiar historical and cultural situation, they cannot recognize the impossible and quixotic character of their self-appointed task. This concept of morality that MacIntyre sees the Enlightenment tradition lacking is that of a telos. This term famously comes from Aristotle, and it refers to the end or purpose of human life. In a framework that incorporates a telos, there is a sharp and vital distinction between man as he happens to be, and man as he could be if he realized his essential nature, with ethics seen as the science that enabled human beings to understand how to make the transition from the former to the latter state. To give a clearer image of what this might look like, MacIntyre points out Aristotle's starting point for ethical enquiry, that the relationship of man to living well is analogous to that of a harpist to playing the harp well. On this conception, the project of ethics is concerned with discovering how humans live well and then taking actions to live this way. MacIntyre sees ethics as doomed to emotivism when it is divorced from a telos. For what constitutes the good for humans is a complete human life lived at its best, one in which the exercise of the virtues is a necessary and central part of such a life. The exercising of the virtues is the meat and potatoes of my coverage of MacIntyre for this video. To understand the exercising of the virtues according to MacIntyre is to understand three concepts: practice, narrative unity of life, and tradition. A practice is any coherent and complex form of socially established cooperative human activity through which goods internal to that form of activity are realized in the course of trying to achieve those standards of excellence which are appropriate to, and partially definitive of, that form of activity, with the result that human powers to achieve excellence and human conceptions of the ends and goods involved are systematically extended. It's almost impossible to understand this quote in isolation from the book, so it's easier to work with an example given by MacIntyre: chess. A number of people play chess with a goal in mind: to be a better chess player. They take certain actions to realize this goal, such as joining a chess club or organization, playing other people who are good at chess, or learning and strategizing on how to play better. These actions help them realize their ultimate purpose or goal insofar as they are a chess player. In this way, chess itself is a practice, as it is an activity that provides the context for this type of purpose-oriented experience. For MacIntyre, a virtue is an acquired human quality, the possession and exercise of which tends to enable us to achieve those goods which are internal to practices, and the lack of which effectively prevents us from achieving any such goods. So it sounds kind of funny, but continuing with the example, we can think of virtues of a good chess player: adaptability, resilience, studiousness. These are qualities that contribute to the realization of the telos of being a good chess player. People develop virtues within practices to realize the goods that arise within a given practice. The narrative unity of life stems from MacIntyre's observation that human behavior cannot be understood simply as stretches of bodily movements. In order for some movements to count as actions at all, we must characterize them in relation to the intentions, desires, and goals of the person whose bodily movements they are. To use a similar example to MacIntyre, suppose a man is digging a hole outside. While we can easily visualize him doing the physical action of digging, if someone asks us, what is he doing, we are compelled to give reasons for why he is digging the hole. Perhaps it gives him satisfaction to develop his digging abilities, or perhaps he is searching for rare earth metals, or maybe he's a construction worker. It is not enough to merely acknowledge his physical act, but rendering an action intelligible is a matter of grasping it as an episode in the history of an agent's life and of the setting in which it occurs. In this case, the action is located in the context of digging ability, treasure hunting, or construction work, perhaps to provide for his family. Analogously, in the moral sphere, when we have a telos, we can make sense of the actions a person takes in terms of whether it furthers them toward the proper realization of themselves or not. We live out our lives, both individually and in our relationships with each other, in the light of certain conceptions of a possible shared future, a future in which certain possibilities beckon us forward and others repel us. Some seem already foreclosed and others perhaps inevitable. There is no present which is not informed by some image of some future, and an image of the future which always presents itself in the form of a telos, or of a variety of ends or goals, towards which we are either moving or failing to move in the present. From this, a central thesis then begins to emerge. Man is, in his actions and practice, essentially a storytelling animal. Upon this realization, a person can ask reflective questions about themselves. For example, if I am weighing options between chess practice and helping my neighbor, I ask, who am I really, a chess player or a neighbor? Answering this question will present us with the option of what we should do, not merely what is permissible or what we should not do. The virtues, therefore, are to be understood as those dispositions which will not only sustain practices and enable us to achieve the goods internal to practices, but which will also sustain us in the relevant kind of quest for the good, by enabling us to overcome the harms, dangers, temptations, and distractions which we encounter, and which will furnish us with increasing self-knowledge and increasing knowledge of the good. One can imagine at this point that the virtuous life that we seek may be informed by the circumstances that a person finds themselves in, intellectually and socially. But, MacIntyre says, it is not just that different individuals live in different social circumstances. It is also that we all approach our own circumstances as bearers of particular social identity. I am someone's son or daughter, someone else's cousin or uncle. I am a citizen of this or that city, a member of this or that guild or profession. I belong to this nation. Thus, it is highly possible that roles and obligations will be inherited from these contexts. At this point, to clear MacIntyre of the charge of following tradition blindly, I feel compelled to include what immediately follows this assertion. This thought is likely to appear alien and even surprising from the standpoint of modern individualism. From the standpoint of individualism, I may legally be a citizen of a certain country, and I cannot be held responsible for what my country does or has done unless I choose implicitly or explicitly to assume such responsibility. Such individualism is expressed by those modern Americans who deny any responsibility for the effects of slavery upon Black Americans, saying, "I never owned any slaves." In this way, being an American is not in itself taken to be part of the moral identity of the individual. As one can see, traditions for MacIntyre are not always traditional in the popular usage of the word. They may be primarily religious or moral, political, economic, aesthetic, or geographical. So, the background of traditions will determine the individual's resources for making rational decisions about how to pursue her quest for the good. However, note Mulhall and Swift, this seems to leave us prey to relativistic worries. In a world with many traditions, if we have no rational criteria to judge between competing traditions, we may have no idea whether to remain in one or adopt another, and the choice might be made arbitrary. Viewers of my previous video might notice a similarity here between this argument and the one made by Thomas Kuhn in the Philosophy of Science. Later in his career, MacIntyre publishes Whose Justice, Whose Rationality? Contained within this text is a discussion of relativism in regards to traditions. Here he professes that it is untrue that traditions, understood as each possessing its own account of and practices of rational justification, therefore cannot defeat or be defeated by other traditions. His answer for how traditions are vindicated or fail to be vindicated pertains to their adequacy or inadequacy in their responses to epistemological crises. Once again, this is close to the historical view espoused by Thomas Kuhn for scientific traditions. I really recommend you watch my previous video after this one if you haven't already seen it. Examples are present in MacIntyre's own intellectual life. The younger MacIntyre was a Marxist, due only to Marxism's capacity to articulate truths that are not articulable in other ideological frameworks, such as Marxism's account of the distorting effects on human life and human relationships produced by the economic and political institutions of modern capitalism. The later MacIntyre would eventually turn away from Marxism and toward an Aristotelian Catholic framework due to his belief that it is the most coherent worldview. Note, however, that MacIntyre would not say the shifts in his intellectual life were mere relativistic preferences, and in this way he differs slightly from Thomas Kuhn. In Whose Justice, MacIntyre gives his hypothetical relativists a challenge. They might claim that one can only select a tradition based on arbitrary preference, and thus we cannot escape the original problem of emotivism that MacIntyre wants to be free from. However, MacIntyre notices that, in approaching various traditions, one is already using an evaluative framework to see which one is superior to others, but this does not arise spontaneously out of nothing, but can only be constructed through the individual's interaction with their tradition. For example, one might evaluate the importance of allegiance to their country by considering a particular philosophical value in doing so, or they might see this as nationalism that betrays more fundamental values of multiculturalism or something else entirely. The point is that the choice the individual makes will be informed by the traditions they were brought up in, and the traditions they interact with, and relativism is included within a specific tradition of skepticism. As MacIntyre says, to be outside all traditions is to be a stranger to inquiry. It is to be in a state of intellectual and moral destitution, a condition from which it is impossible to issue the relativist challenge. He pushes back on the notion that someone investigating different traditions can really stand completely outside of them. Finally, after this understanding, we can return to the interaction between Rawlsian liberalism and MacIntyre's view. Because of the necessity of concepts of practices with their respective virtues, narrative unity and traditions, Mulhall and Swift believe that MacIntyre is a fundamentally communitarian thinker. On his view, sustaining rationality and objectivity in the arena of moral and political evaluation depends upon locating individuals within an overarching and nested set of inherently social matrices or contexts. This is a more fleshed out view of community, which our previous thinker Sandel holds to be so important, giving us possibly a greater insight to those community-oriented conceptions of the good that he discusses. MacIntyre mentions Rawls explicitly in After Virtue. For Rawls, a society is composed of individuals, each with his or her own interest, who then have to come together and formulate common rules of life. In Rawls' case, the only constraints are those that prudent rationality would impose. But as we know, for MacIntyre, the ways in which we make sense of ourselves through rationality and objectivity can only arise in a communal context, so there would be no way to achieve this conception of the good in liberal society formed in the Rawlsian project. That is, justice as fairness would not have any properly rational grounding. It is notable that MacIntyre became more friendly to liberalism in between the writing of After Virtue and Whose Justice. Mulhall and Swift also add in a final note that he does not want to reintroduce an Aristotelian conception of the good at the level of the nation-state, and from a practical political standpoint does not believe that forcing this conception while leaving all other conditions the same is the best way forward, and in this way he is not too far off from liberalism at the national level. In light of these facts, the reader will have to decide for themselves what bearing MacIntyre's project has on Rawlsian theory. It is worth noting that MacIntyre believes that liberal individualism does indeed have its own broad conception of the good, which it is engaged in imposing politically, legally, socially, and culturally wherever it has the power to do so, but also that in doing so its toleration of rival conceptions of the good in public arena is severely limited. In this way, liberal theory is best understood not at all as an attempt to find a rationality independent of a tradition, but as itself the articulation of a historically developed and developing set of social institutions and forms of activity, that is, as the voice of a tradition. This should be relatively clear based on our understanding of a tradition we have developed so far, and this is not a weakness in MacIntyre's view as he believes the tradition is necessary. Since the political and moral are so deeply intertwined, his criticism is best understood as a push for the breakdown of the political and private spheres of morality that liberalism falsely delineates. Thank you so much to Gordon for the new background and thumbnail as usual. Here is my social media. Thank you for watching.